actually a literacy teacher, which I'm really fond of saying, and I brought Martin Flanagan of The Age to my students because I felt I only knew a few little humble bits about how to get them to write, and it kind of started with him. He came, he said, I like what you're trying to do, I like the stories they're telling, he thought they were real, and then we just got a bit of gumption from that. We got, well, let's invite so-and-so, and then you'd read Romulus, My Father, and you were so moved. So I've just gone on instinct, who moves me, who are the people I'd like to sit down literally at the kitchen table and go, can I just ask you all these questions? You know what I mean? And I just follow that kind of instinct, and it's developed into this. And of course, Susanna comes along and goes, let's do them as part of professional writing. What's a writing department that doesn't have this wonderful swirling activity around it? You know what I mean? So, and the students can come and learn from them in ways they're not going to learn in class.
What I love about Rotunda is that it's a surprise. It's a surprise every time. I've now been involved with 41 of them. And you would think they become a bit the same, but you get there, people start to arrive, there's a real buzz about the whole thing. That gets you a little bit excited, and then the writers come on and there's the conversation, and it's magic. I love it that it gets ordinary people coming along who maybe like to sit in the corner and hear about writing. They might not be ready to dabble themselves in it, but they just like to hear the conversation and to hear that kind of intelligent conversation that happens. The other thing I love about it is that it's not just packaged up. It's not packaged up to sell anyone's books. You know, it's there to be something meaningful for the people there. And look, for the people who are there, it really feels like one of those magic special nights that is never going to happen again, ever.
What a fantastic crowd. Are you all feeling romantic? You're going to be so loved up by the time we finish tonight. My love affair with writing began exactly as it should have, with other people's words. The Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, Mark Twain, Louisa May Alcott, my grandmother's letters to me, and St. Paul's to the Corinthians. But before that, before I was even born, there was my father reading to my pregnant mother the medieval tale of a Norwegian girl called Kristin Lavransdatter. This was the story that gave me my name, a chapter in my own romance, my personal creation myth. Then, when I was 10 years old, I got a birthday gift. It was a small pink book, the pages blank, all mine to fill. It was a terrible thrill, realizing that I could make and remake the world better suited to my needs than the one my harsh God had designed. Only the garden for me, thanks. Serpent-free and filled with characters who held their mouths open so I could pour in the purple ink of my imagination. Writing was my powerful, swashbuckling hero, bending the bars of my childhood prison. They say infatuation's early days are simply narcissism. And I was a solitary child, a born exaggerator, a self-creator. It was all about me. The high-flown lies, the low sentimentality, poetic license came naturally. When I was 17, my first menage a trois. The boy didn't care that he'd have to share. When you're in love and young, poetry is your native tongue. There was not much evidence of grandeur in our little town, so I was easily seduced. Writing was my private lover, bellowing into the flames of other passions. Terror and hunger in every syllable, all the things a girl could write but never speak aloud. Every kind of naive hope, each exquisite pain and trembling wish bled out of me and onto paper. Metaphor and simile were secret codes for saying the intense unsayable. Soon I was 25, my future all laid out. A very ordinary life, a mother and a wife. The decade stretched ahead. I was sure I'd made my bed, and it looked like I would not be lying in it with writing. Instead, those were unfaithful years when love of family claimed me. My world became the distance between mailbox and clothesline. And yet I sometimes found myself in the midnight kitchen, alone with the sleeping breath from other rooms of all my precious ones, and a notebook for the containment of ideas too big for our house. It's embarrassing to remember how my husband and my children sometimes ask me where I disappeared to in the middle of checking homework or just before the lights went out. I'd slipped off to writing for hours at a time. We'd picked up where we'd left off, more urgent than ever and more jealous. For no matter where I was or with whom, my thoughts were on the words, their order, their number, their pitch and pace, adding and subtracting, shading and shaping, fantasizing every possible position, playing and replaying the last pin strokes against the page, rehearsing the next, my eyes glazed over, my smile fixed, my ears incapable of hearing the daily dealing in conversation, begrudging every minute that took me away from my own words. Till by the end of that decade, my addiction made me shameless. I had started pounding out obsession on a silvery, second-hand Olivetti. When I turned 35, I had some hard-living years. Promiscuous days with stories and plays, with essays and reviews, but it was poetry I'd choose. I gave myself to its language, and it was mostly good to me. Enchanted hours in its company passed like seconds. Together, we would never be rich. But words would fly me around the world and introduce me to ways so strange and wonderful, I'd grow impervious to static lovers. Then they'd bring me home and make me take a sharper look at the familiar. For the next 20 years, writing took all I had. There were marriages and kids, but whatever else I did, it was still the two of us. I was almost monogamous. Sure, I sometimes got my head turned, but by gentler diversions, television, cricket, sex, piano lessons. For writing is a dragon of a partner. We don't curl around each other on Friday nights, settling for safety. Writing forgives nothing. It rails against my cliches, forbids me to be maudlin. It robs me of sleep, shakes its finger at my laziness, won't listen to excuses. All this insistence on commitment, and yet sometimes it leaves me for months at a time. We argue often when my ego makes me stubborn, but I've learned that the words know best. They reach inside and take me out and play with me, then put me back breathless, blushing, astounded. I know people roll their eyes when they catch me laughing to myself. That's when writings come up behind me and whispered some irreverence in my ear. If you tied my writing hands behind my back, I'd be vanilla girl, obedient, mild. It's only writing peels me open, so a darker wildness in my head roars out. Without a pen or a keyboard, I'm a logical girl, predictable. Only writing frees me, the drug and dream of poetry, drawing pictures of impossible truths and singing sweet unexpectedness to my thoughts. So how do things stand now? Was my time running out? Is there still the fire, still the same desire? Can passion stay alive once you're 65? The fact is, all my life, hardly a night has passed without me feeling that old caress of print on paper. Writing has been my one constant. Long ago we found our rhythms were the same. Since then, more than anything, we've learned to listen to each other. Once in a while I get scared those days driven by obsession might be gone for good, and I'll have to make do with the companionship of memory. But then, some unexpected turn of phrase shoots 1,000 volts straight through me, and I'm a teenager again. Just last week, the beauty of another writer's perfect sentence made me swoon. Long and meandering, its teasing tone invited me to follow it to the end, and it was worth it. I was well satisfied. We were intimate in a way no tweeted 140-word one-night stand could ever hope to match. Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm very pleased to be here again at Rotunda. I've always enjoyed being here, and particularly tonight with such distinguished company. Where else could I have had a conversation with Bob Murphy, that classy, courageous Western Bulldogs footballer, and a member of the All-Australian team? This is what I wrote to Bruno after that conversation earlier this year. I quote, "It was one of the best public conversations in which I've taken part. All my family loved it, but the conversation was genuinely between the three of us, and I've no doubt that's why it worked so well and why so many people appeared to be touched by it. It's rare for people in your position to work as hard preparing for the evening. Not only did you read all the necessary books and interviews, and in Bob's case, his columns, but you think with great sensitivity about what to do with the results of your research in order to engage with tactful penetration what matters most to the people you've invited to share the stage with you. That, at any rate, has been my experience on all the occasions I've come to Rotunda, and who can resist your warmth?" End of quote. I feel, though, a bit of a fraud here this evening, because in the title for the event, My Enduring Love Affair with Writing, the word writing takes a capital W for reasons other than the fact that it's in the title. I'm not a writer with a capital W. I mean that, I'm not being coy. I'm often appalled by the clumsiness of my prose, but when my efforts to ameliorate that are even partially successful, they don't yield for me pleasure of a kind a writer takes, by definition, I'm inclined to say, in a well-constructed sentence. A dear friend, the poet and essayist Peter Steele, who died recently, wrote a wonderful essay called Poetry as the Mind in Love. You can read it in his collection called Braiding the Voices, Essays in Poetry. The title of his essay could be generalized to writing as the mind in love, of course, with language. I'm not that kind of lover. It's true that I've said to my wife, Yael, and to some friends, but never publicly, that I wish I could write poetry. But one reason I know that I never could is just because I'm not that kind of lover. I'd like to write poetry, not because I'd like to create poems in which I and others could delight, but because I believe that if I could write good poetry, it would make my sensibility, make me more adequate to the wondrous complexity and beauty of the world. I must confess, though, that for someone who's not a writer, the impulse to write came early and in a polemical voice. In 1956 or 57, when I was 10 or 11, I wrote my first book, self-published, of course, in paperback. School exercises don't come in hardback. With photographs, even. I don't remember its title exactly, but it was something like Elvis Presley, Devil or Hero. It was a defense of Elvis against those who called his music devil music, and was inspired by hearing him sing Baby Let's Play House. It had quite an impact on its sole reader, my father. He told me he wanted never to see it again, and even threatened to tear it up. The polemical impulse continued into my university years, but its reception didn't improve. Of an article I wrote as an undergraduate, a student reviewer wrote something like the following in Farrago, quote, pretty much a quote, "Following Sartre, Gaita distinguishes beings that are things in themselves from beings that are things for themselves. But if you ask me, the whole thing is up itself." And when I wrote over 50 columns for Robert Mann's Quadrant, readers complained to Rob every month, saying that they couldn't understand a word I wrote. One of them, though, must have got the hang of the structure of my admittedly long sentences, because he wrote a letter to the editor in which he said, I quote, "Each month I wait with masochistic anticipation for the arrival of Quadrant to see what new barbarities Raymond Gaita has perpetrated on the English language." End of quote. But judging by the hate mail and hostile telephone calls I got when I wrote about the injustices against our Indigenous peoples, a lot of readers understood me only too well. Would I now spoil a good story if I say that I indulged revengeful wishes fulfilled, albeit with a sense of irony, when The Economist, just the kind of magazine my Quadrant critics read with respect, nominated A Common Humanity, which included revised versions of some of the Quadrant essays, as one of the best books of 2000. I thought, well, there you are. Nonetheless, you'll understand, I think, why when some people urged me to write about my father and our life together in central Victoria, I replied that while there might be a good story there, I wasn't the person to write it. Well, I did write it. The intensity of the experience of writing the first draft in only 3 weeks came second only to the intensity of falling in love with Yael, though in the case of writing Romulus, the experience was of exhilaration alternating with depression. When it was published, things changed dramatically. People called me a writer. I was invited to writers' festivals. Always, I sincerely protested that I'm not a writer, and always people thought I couldn't really mean it. I don't want to leave you with a wrong impression about my attitude to language. I don't think of it as being merely an instrument of communication for our thoughts, in my case, more or less philosophical thoughts. The late English philosopher Bernard Williams tells the possibly apocryphal story of two philosophers writing a book together. One says to the other, "Let's first get the content right, then you can add the style." Conceived this way, style connects to content only insofar as it gives a clear expression. For the rest, it's adornment, sometimes pleasing, sometimes irritating, but often suspect because on this account it appeals to feeling rather than to thought. The ideal that informs that conception of the relations between style and content is that we should try to put anything that is genuinely cognitive, genuinely a matter for thought and understanding, in a form to which the objection that it's sentimental or cliched or shows a tinge of irony would be as inappropriate as would be to lodge such an objection to a proposition in physics or mathematics. Real thought, thought directed at understanding, according to this way of thinking, of what it is to be obedient to the voice of reason, strives to exist in a kind of tone-free zone. Well, in my writing, I've been critical of this way of thinking about what it is really to seek understanding, but it's a way of thinking that goes very deep in Western culture. I've elaborated and defended a conception of thought and understanding in which head and heart are inseparably combined. In books like The Philosopher's Dog and After Romulus, I've tried to practice what I preach. An experiment in narrative philosophy, the philosopher Roger Scruton called The Philosopher's Dog, and the same might be said of some of the essays in After Romulus. Though my books are of different kinds, the philosopher is evident in all of them, I think, even in Romulus, my father. True, I'm regarded as a maverick, as a philosopher and as an academic. In books like A Common Humanity, The Philosopher's Dog, and in some of the essays in After Romulus, I've wanted to write to what I take to be a lay audience, educated and prepared to think hard, an audience that doesn't assume that if one has to read a sentence twice, it must be the fault of the author. But when I write for such people, it's not to introduce them to philosophy or to make philosophy simple and accessible to them. I assume they're already thinking more or less philosophical thoughts. Who, after all, doesn't have an opinion on whether truth is absolute or relative, and ditto for morality? So I hope to say to them, without a trace of condescension, I know the technical difficulties in the discipline. I know the gap that exists between what a good, honest paper on these subjects would look like and most discussions of them in literary magazines and in other non-academic media. But let's see how far we can go together, thinking together, before we reach the kinds of difficulties that are appreciated only by someone who's immersed in the discipline. I also hope that those writings contribute to the discipline. I want to speak to the discipline as well as to the general reader, and in one and the same book. How I could even hope to do that is something I don't have time to explain this evening. Though I've been a severe critic of the universities and of the academic practice of philosophy and other disciplines, the academy matters profoundly to me. That's where many of the bright young people go, and I want to be there with them, to speak with them about the treasures that could be theirs, which are their rightful inheritance, but which are these days all too often denied them. And for that reason, I wanted next year to begin to write, I've been thinking about this for years, a book which, if anything I wrote deserved to be called a magnum opus, would be it. At its centre will be a conception of morality of a kind that I've developed in other works. And in one direction, it'll go via moral psychology and evolutionary theory to a philosophy of nature. And in the other direction, to a philosophy of law and politics. Before that, though, I intend to write a different book of an altogether different kind, the kind of book that really does give me great pleasure to write. It'll be a book celebrating people, friends and teachers who have mattered profoundly to me in my life. Thank you.
It was a fantastic night, and it was a real privilege to be reading with these other wonderful writers. And as always, anytime Rotunda organises anything, it's a great success, and the audience was so receptive, and I'm just thrilled that I got to be part of it.
I thought it was a really wonderful evening, and the reason that it was because everybody was so good and delivered such wonderful pieces. And the reason they did, I'm absolutely sure, is for Bruno and for Rotunda. It was a very special occasion of such high standard and quality.